All right, hello everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Today we're doing a Chinese, or I guess Beijing style, noodle dish called Zha Jiang Mian. For those who have never heard of Zha Jiang Mian, I would be a little surprised because they're really, really popular. But here in the Bay Area, definitely you'll find it in a lot of places. It's one of my favorite noodle dishes, and what it is essentially, what I've always thought of it as is sort of like a Chinese bolognese without basically all of the things that make a bolognese a bolognese. So like more like a Chinese meat sauce noodle dish, I guess. So it's one of those dishes. I've been eating it since I was a little kid. We're going to take a look at all of the ways that my dad used to make this, which sort of makes it a weird Americanized version of what we're cooking today. So we're going to dive into all of that today and a couple of other fun things. So as always with everything that we cook on these streams, there's a recipe that goes along with the thing that we're cooking. Those always live over on my YouTube channel, so if you're watching over on Reddit, that's the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. We have Friday, so if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel yet, definitely hop over there and see what's going on, because we've got new stuff coming out every week. This week, or this Friday coming up, as in tomorrow, we have a recipe for a Chinese shumai, which is a steamed dumpling that you'll probably most often would see come up in a lot of like dim sum and like dim sum based cuisines. So that's coming up tomorrow. After that's going to be, I think we're doing fried rice burritos after that, and lots of other fun stuff coming up. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely make your way over to YouTube and check out that stuff. Lots of cool things coming up. Cool. As always, also, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer everyone. I don't know everything about Zha Jiang Mian, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully that can be helpful or informative. Miley, yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, thank you for tuning into the channel. Cool. So as with many of our stir fries, is pretty much all of the Chinese stir fries especially, we're starting off, that was what I just finished chopping up, was 4 cloves of crushed and minced garlic. And next what we're doing here, this is about an inch-ish, or about 1 tablespoon of finely minced ginger. So as you can imagine, ginger, being a root veggie, grows in a lot of weird and awkward shapes. So measuring ginger before it's chopped is a little bit tricky, because what does actually 1 inch of ginger mean? It could mean a lot of things depending on the shape and size of the ginger. So what I like to say is about 1 inch, or once it's chopped, we're looking for about a tablespoon. And if you've watched any of these recipes, or watched any of the recipes, or watched any of these videos before, you'll know that at various points in time I have actually chopped too much ginger. And usually when that happens, I just end up throwing it out because I don't see any point in trying to save ginger. So we're starting off with what is essentially a large dice, like medium dice. And then we're going to run our knife through it, like so. And at this point, it's also very, very helpful to make sure that your knife is nice and sharp. Dull knives are really, really hard to do a fine mince with, because it kind of just ends up mashing the ginger into the cutting board instead of actually chopping it. So it's very useful. If your knife is not sharp, make sure you sharpen it before you do this part. And that is our ginger. The other thing I'll also mention, in a lot of stir fries and definitely in a lot of live streams, I stop a little bit early on the ginger mincing, like we just did. That was maybe not my best fine mince, but sometimes I'll stop early because I'm lazy. And you can actually get away with it if you're planning on stir frying it, because once it goes into that stir fry, it's going to come open and come apart a little bit more. I generally don't recommend that if you don't plan on stir frying it, because that actually might not happen if you do something like if you're throwing it into a sauce, or if you don't plan on cooking it at all. That might not work as well as you think or as you're expecting. Here they are. Cool. Next up, we're going to do a couple of veggies here. So in the original recipe, what I had called for was a carrot and a cucumber, I think. I think that's what we used. I ran out of cucumbers. Actually, I didn't run out. They went bad. So we're not going to use any cucumbers today. What we're going to do is substitute that out with another of my favorite green veggie, which is a little bit of green onion. What we're going to do today, so we're going to treat our green onions very specifically for a couple of reasons. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm taking these whites, that's just the white part of the green onion, which is a little bit more durable. You'll notice that it's got this nice thick and like really sturdy quality to it. And what we're going to do is slice this up thinly. You can do this sliced straight. Try not to drop them. And then what we're going to do is set this aside, and this is going to go into our wok fry with our other aromatics. So lots of times you'll see me set these three ingredients aside and treat them as our aromatics, which is essentially the first three things that go into our wok fry. So here's our ginger, garlic, and our whites of our green onions. These are going to be the first three things that go into our wok fry, which we're going to set aside. And then next what we're going to do is we're going to take these greens, and what we're essentially trying to do is substitute them for those carrots, or for the cucumbers we're leaving out, which means that I'm going to try and slice them pretty thick or pretty wide in order to sort of like mimic the quality that you would normally get from large planks of cucumbers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm setting my knife at a very, very large bias, so it's almost parallel. So here's this green onions, and this knife is almost parallel. And then what we're going to do is slice them at a really, really large bias, like so. And again, anytime that we're chopping green onions, we want to pull back on the knife. Don't push down on the knife like this, because that's essentially going to smash those green onions into the cutting board, which is not what we're after. So we're using our back slice here. That's going to give us these nice, long, wide pieces of green onion that look like this. They're also really pretty, so I like slicing the greens that way. So we're going to set this aside as part of our garnish. So we're going to have two garnishes today. The first is going to be these greens. Really nice and pretty. And then the second and other, maybe also very important, ingredient that we're going to use as a garnish today, I'm running out of counter space, is this carrot, which I actually think is maybe one of the more important things in Zha Jiang Mian. I Zha Jiang Mian have at least one form of durable veggie. So if you don't have the cucumber, I want to say that you want to try and have the cucumber. If you don't have cucumbers, bean sprouts or any kind of like durable veggie will work. Zucchini, my dad used to use lima beans a lot. I know my dad used to use edamame quite a bit. All of those acceptable substitutes. What we're really looking for is that really, really dense quality about those veggies. So what we're doing here, so I just sliced off the root and tip, which we just threw out. And then, I just want this to be a little bit shorter actually. And then what we're going to do is our Julian cut, which we're going to start off by chopping into planks, like so. Then we're going to flatten them out and go downward. So one more time, because that was not good. Here's our first, I like it. And then we're pushing them down so they're essentially stacked. And then we're going to slice down for our planks. By the way, paper chop. just a time-consuming, intensive chop. One more time, putting in the planks here. And then pushing them down flat and slicing down. And essentially what we're doing with this Julian chop right now is that we're trying to make sure that our carrots, they should at least a pretty similar texture and as our noodles. So we're trying to get a very like cohesive bites. So we want relatively similar textures to our garnish as our noodles. Cool. This is a very fresh carrot. If you're not which I was just putting together our Pantry Essentials. It's coming out soon. Carrots, really great thing to have in your pantry because they stay for a super long time. I usually will always have carrots in my pantry because you can buy in very, very large quantities and then just leave them in your refrigerator and they'll stay for quite a while. If you do notice that your carrots are starting to go, what you'll probably see first, going to start turning a little bit mushy. And that's generally the sign that your carrots are starting to go. But for me, that usually takes quite a while, probably a couple of months before that starts happening. So here's our planks at this point. We're going to flatten them out so that they're stacked on top of each other, flatten this way, and then chopping downward. Am I left-handed? Yes, I am. Lots of people ask that. I am left-handed, which means that also that I feel like is something that most right-handed people don't realize. But almost everything is designed for right-handed people. You realize it or not, most of the things that you come across in kitchens are designed to be ergonomic for right-handers. Which means that a lot of the times when I'm in other people's kitchens, and even sometimes when I'm in my own kitchen, I end up having to do stuff backwards, which is super, super annoying. So for example, lots of times you'll notice that the refrigerator, it's on the right side of the stove. If you're left-handed, you want that stove, the refrigerator to open in this direction, but the refrigerator actually open the other direction. If this kitchen was set up for a left-handed person, the refrigerator should be on this side. It's designed to be ergonomic so that you can open that refrigerator with your left hand, or with your right hand, excuse me. Lots of weird little things like that, they end up being a problem for people who are left-handed. Yeah, cool. So that's our carrots. I'm gonna set that aside. And then next up, before I forget, let's do our mushrooms. Let's take all these out. Good tips for beginners, yeah. Glad I can help. Oh, so first, before I forget, I want to get to these shiitakes. So it's also a source of where a lot of the umami in our noodles are going to come from today is from these shiitake mushrooms. If you've never used a shiitake mushroom, you will almost always see them sold dry. I don't think I've ever come across a fresh shiitake mushroom. Usually you'll find them in the dried goods section. Usually I find them, specifically here in Chinatown, I'll usually find them from a grocery store that's specifically designated for dried goods. So there's literally an entire shop that's designated for dried mushrooms, so that's nice. And then what we're going to do is this is just a little bit of boiled water, and we're going to soak this for about 5 minutes. You'll notice a couple things about my shiitake mushrooms, that they're a little bit thinner than the normal shiitake mushrooms that you'll come across, and they also have their stems removed already. I love this about the shiitake mushrooms that I use because it makes it a lot easier to rehydrate. So if you have really thick shiitake mushrooms, that can take quite a while Sometimes that takes like at least 20-25 minutes. When I use the really thick ones, lots of times you'll even see that I'll start rehydrating them before I even start the stream because they take that long to rehydrate. Those really thin ones, they hydrate within maybe like 5 minutes or so. But if you're working with those really thick ones, you definitely want to start rehydrating those really, really early. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting around waiting for those mushrooms to hydrate, which is not ideal. So while those are rehydrating, we're going to let those go for about 5 minutes, and then we're going to slice them up. In the meantime, we're going to get to our marinade on our. What are we using today? This pork. Actually, I think this is ground turkey. Actually, forgot what we're using today. Which, by the way, reminds me. I think today we're using ground turkey. I actually can't remember if this is turkey or pork. Probably the most common thing that you'll see is some ground pork. Anything really fatty or heavy in fat is going to do the trick. So I'm doing a really quick marinade here that is actually 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and half a teaspoon of white pepper. And finally, half a teaspoon of cornstarch. So if you followed any of these recipes before, like any of the recipes that come from Wu Can Cook, you'll know that that's probably like the standard marinade that I use. So I think it's probably the one that comes up most when I don't know what else to do with a marinade, or at the very least it's the marinade that I use when I didn't write a marinade for the chicken, which is actually this recipe does not contain a marinade for the, not the chicken, but the ground meat. So I've always thought of it as a pretty good standby. Soy sauce plus that white pepper, it gives it a nice bit of umami as a sort of like a baseline. Whereas most of the umami, it's actually going to come from our sauce later on. But this nice little layer of umami is going to come from that soy sauce and that white pepper. If you don't have white pepper, you can also use black pepper or like fresh ground pepper. I actually prefer using white pepper because I find that it's the finer quality about it tends to like really well. Sorry, this camera's just gonna keep turning off. So that's probably like my standby marinade if I don't know what else to do, I think. Cool, so next up we're gonna dive into our sauce base here. And if you've ever ordered this from a restaurant, usually you'll see them have this in like large quantities, probably like a whole bucket of it. And usually they'll drop it in with a ladle on heat. That's probably like pre-mixed, and they might even do it in bulk, like probably during prep. What I like to do, I like to assemble this stuff off heat and then sort of give us a chance to stop and taste what's going on here. So that's sort of like this opportunity to adjust. If you're not sure what things are tasting like, we're essentially inserting some opportunity to stop and taste. That's the start. That was 4 tablespoons of soy sauce and 1 tablespoon of sesame oil. Then next, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing Wine. Shaoxing Wine, if you're not familiar, I think that's it, we just killed it. Shaoxing Wine, if you're not familiar, is a form of Chinese cooking wine. It is not, I think it's more than a little bit similar. It's basically dry cooking sherry. And actually, if you can get your hands on really good and really high quality dry cooking sherry, I think it might even be better than the Shaoxing wine that you'll find in most Chinese grocery stores. And that's really just because the Shaoxing wine that you get in Chinese grocery stores is like very processed. It's what makes it so cheap. I think you could get a bottle for like $2. So what I always say is if you can't find Shaoxing wine, definitely don't feel weird about substituting it for dry cooking sherry. Because it might even be better than the Shaoxing wine that you're using in Chinese cooking. Next up, that was 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar, which I like to say is optional. I think it helps a little bit because it gives us a little bit of extra brightness that Shaoxing wine is not really bringing, but definitely optional because that Shaoxing wine is where all of our brightness is coming from already. Next up, that's 2 tablespoons of hoisin sauce, followed by 2 tablespoons of oyster sauce. Oyster sauce and hoisin sauce, you'll notice they look similar. They're both very dark and like almost like syrupy in quality. They don't taste very similar at all though. Hoisin sauce has a very, very sweet, like almost aggressively sweet quality. I always think of it as like the ketchup of Chinese food almost. Whereas oyster sauce is derived from the fermentation of oyster, which makes it a little bit more fishy. And then last up, is maybe the single most important thing. There's one thing that you can leave out, If there's one thing that you absolutely cannot leave out, you could probably leave out almost everything else that we just added here. This is literally the only thing that you can't leave out, and that's some black bean sauce. It is probably the single most iconic thing that's associated with Zha Jiang Mian. So what we're doing, this is going to be 4 tablespoons of black bean sauce, black bean paste. Yeah. Academic stick. Good username. What are we making? Yeah. Today hello to everyone just tuning in. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. Today we're doing a Zha Jiang Mian, which is a Chinese noodle dish that's like pretty common in like a lot of especially here in the States, a lot of Americanized Chinese food we've seen come up quite a bit. What is essentially is a Chinese meat sauce that relies very heavily, the Chinese version at least relies very heavily on the use of black bean sauce, which is what we just added here. There is, I also should mention, an equivalent dish in a lot of other Asian cultures. So there's the very, very similar dish in Korean culture called Zha Jiang Mian, spelled with a J. There's a similar dish in Japanese food called, I think it's called, in Japanese. It's also very similar, but it's done with ramen. You'll see the similar concept in a lot of Asian cuisine, usually with similar naming. And that's probably mostly because it's not a very complicated concept. It's it all comes from like the very similar idea of it's basically a meat sauce with some sort of like very, very heavy umami-based quality, like black bean paste, and then tossed in the noodles. So I think the Korean versions that I've had usually features seafood. You come across a lot of like shrimp and other forms of seafood in the Korean versions. Japanese versions that I've had usually feature some form of ramen noodle. Today, the version that we're cooking, oops, I forgot to boil water. Today, the version that we're doing today is the Chinese version. Today, we're doing the Chinese version, which is going to feature some hand-rolled noodles, which look like this. If you can't find the hand-rolled stuff, I highly recommend looking for the hand-rolled stuff because it makes a huge difference. But if you can't find it though, you could also make use of dried spaghetti. Dried spaghetti is probably a fine alternative. Might be a little bit weird, but I've actually done it on more than one occasion when I've forgotten to get noodles. So don't feel weird about substituting in dried spaghetti. Excuse me while I boil some water. So that's what we're going to be using today is these nice hand-rolled noodles. I always recommend, if you can find them, find the fresh noodles. But if you can't, though, you can also find pantry stable Chinese noodles, which are very useful to have on hand. I usually have at least some in my pantry, just in case I forget to buy noodles or if I can't find them. The fresh stuff that we're going to be using today, this stuff is very, very unstable in the pantry. It really only stays good for about a day or two. And that's if you start refrigerating them, which I don't recommend. I don't think you should refrigerate those noodles because they get stale. And if you don't refrigerate them, they pretty much will stay for about 24 hours, and then they're going to start molding. So not very pantry friendly. So if you want something more pantry friendly, I highly recommend keeping the other dried stuff on, which I'm pretty sure I have some in the pantry. The Korean version, I think it uses. I think it's a buckwheat noodle. I might be wrong about that. But it's a much thinner noodle though. And then the Japanese version uses some form of. So next up, what we're doing is we're starting to slice up our shiitake mushroom, which we took a look at earlier before we started soaking them. You've noticed that before we started soaking them, they were dried and like pretty stale. You could almost hear them cracking. Now they're nice and plump. They've hydrated pretty well with that boiling water. Ours only took about 5 minutes. It's maybe been a little bit longer. But if you have the thicker stuff, I mentioned this earlier, if you're using thicker shiitake mushrooms, you definitely want to make sure that you hydrate those for a lot longer, probably closer to like 20-25 minutes even. And that's a reason, a couple reasons for Main reason is that shiitake mushroom that's not properly hydrated, it can get your knife will stick into it, and I've had this happen quite a bit. Is if it's not properly hydrated, you go in to start slicing it, and the knife will catch on the parts that are not dry, and then the knife will start slipping. And anytime that your knife starts slipping, that's generally a real bad place to be, because it's probably means that you're going to start cutting yourself. So, dry shiitake mushrooms. Shiitake mushrooms that are not properly hydrated, that's been like the #1 thing that I have almost cut myself on, or even sometimes I have cut myself on, is dried shiitake mushrooms that are not properly hydrated. So beware. Cool, so that's our shiitake mushrooms. What else? Oh yeah, let's do our cornstarch slurry. Okay, the last thing that we're going to assemble before we head over to the stove, hopefully this water starts boiling, is our cornstarch slurry. And this is something that you'll probably see me use in a lot of Chinese food. I like to kind of think of it as sort of how we thicken up sauces. So it's very similar. The way that I've always thought of it is very similar to the way that pasta water is used in Italian cooking. So if you're not familiar, lots of Italian pastas, probably the #1 thing that they rely on is the use of pasta water, and that's basically the water. And what happens in that Italian cook is that as the pasta cooks, that pasta it starts shedding gluten, or starts shedding starch into the water. So once you have this finished pasta cooked, you end up with this very like starchy water, and that's oftentimes you'll see Italian chefs refer to that as what you call liquid gold, because it's basically how all Italian pastas are made. So that's how you get the creaminess in most of those Italian pastas, is coming from that pasta water. It's also the same reason why most of the time when you see folks cooking Italian food, they say that you have to salt the water, it's salty as the sea, which is they dump a lot of salt, usually like a 1/4 cup of salt or more, into that pasta water, is because that pasta water is going to be a big element to your whole dish. It's not just there to boil the water, you're actually using it to create thick sauces. So in Chinese cooking, that's actually not something that I have ever done in a Chinese dish, mostly because I think it's just a cultural thing. You just generally don't see it come up a lot. So what we're going to do is we're going to boil that water, that pasta, and then what we're going to do is we're going to use this cornstarch to thicken up our sauce base. So similar concept, we're still going to be using it to thicken up our sauce. We're still going to be using it in the same concept, in the same fashion that you would use pasta water, but instead of that pasta water, we're going to do it with cornstarch. What's my favorite fungi to cook with? Oh, that's a good question. It would probably be shiitake mushroom. I think that shiitake mushroom has a lot of versatile uses, especially if you're trying to create things that are vegetarian. So I'm just going to start tangenting because we're waiting for this pasta water to boil. But shiitake mushroom, so the way that you create, if you've ever, especially if you're vegetarian and you have ever tried to dip your feet into Chinese cooking, there are a number of like really good alternatives to things like fish sauce and oyster sauce. And the reason for that is what they're trying to do is both of those two things, they're created using fish. That's how they're traditionally done. It's done from the fermentation of fish. But usually those vegetarian, I think they might even be vegan versions, they use the umami from mushroom powder, and that's coming from dry shiitake mushrooms that's been ground up into a powder. So that's probably one of my favorites, is shiitake mushrooms, because it's so versatile. You can use it in so many different contexts, and it's really useful. What I like to do, in today's version, I just slicing those pretty thick. But what I also like to do is dice those shiitakes really thin, and then save a little bit of that water, and that water is also filled with lots of umami. Maitake. Have I ever had maitake? I have not. That sounds maybe Japanese. I've never had it. Cool. All right, so before we head over to the stove, we're going to set up one last thing. Now that we have all this extra time, I'm going to set up this large bowl. This is my largest mixing bowl. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to set up an ice bath. So another very big difference between Chinese noodles and Italian pastas, so like spaghetti, stuff like dry fettuccine, those sorts of things, is that the noodles that we're using today, they're really delicate. So we have these handmade chow fun. Chow fun? I think so. These noodles, they're really delicate. I like to think that they're pretty similar to like a handmade Italian noodle, which means that they cook in about like 2 minutes. Sometimes I even go a little bit shorter than that, close to like a minute and a half. So since they cook in 2 minutes, what we need to do is we need to be pretty accurate with how we cook them. So, and this is generally going to be true with almost anything that you cook in 2 minutes, is that you have to be pretty accurate with when it starts cooking and when it stops cooking. So in order to do that, what I like to do is as we cook that pasta, when it comes out of the water, we need to stop it from continuing to cook as soon as it comes out of the water. So we have to stop it at 2 minutes. If we pull it out and then it keeps cooking, it will probably end up with overcooked noodles. The other way that you can achieve that is pull it out a little early. You might call that al dente in Italian cooking. So what I like to do though, in order to be even more accurate, is cook it at 2 minutes, and then I like to drop it in an ice bath. And the ice bath is going to stop our cook time because it's basically halting all of the cook with that ice. And that's just going to prevent any sort of carryover cook that's going to happen. So over on the stove, here's our water coming to a boil. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not salting that water at all today. Again, not really something that you see in Chinese cooking. And here's our noodles going in. Hopefully that was a pound. I probably should have weighed that out. But I'm pretty sure that these noodles, when you buy them in the market, they're sold in pound mark. It also felt like 1 pound. I've gotten pretty good at eyeballing a pound. So I'm setting a timer. We're going to let this go for exactly 2 minutes. There have been other cases also when I don't remember to boil a pot of water that I have also cooked this off heat. You can also do it just in a big old mixing bowl, drop it in some boiling water, and then just soak it. That usually takes a little bit longer. That can take almost up to like 10 minutes or so. But that more gentle heat, lots of people like to do that because it's a little bit more gentle. I don't mind doing it on heat as long as you're very, very accurate with how you stop the cook. Yeah. Cool, so we're going for 2 minutes here. We're at 1 minute and 3 seconds. So when I say 2 minutes, I mean really, you've got to stop it at 2 minutes on the dot. I don't mean 2 minutes and 15 seconds, not 2 minutes and 20 seconds. 2 minutes on the dot. If it goes past that 2 minutes, you're going to end up with overcooked noodles. These things are super delicate, so we're paying very close attention to our timer here, making sure that we don't overshoot. Yeah. Cool. So I'm just stopping to agitate every once in a while. I think there's a big risk of things clumping together, but although I do still like to go back and move things around just to make sure that things don't start sticking together, and then we end up with. So here's 2 minutes. We're pulling them off heat here. And then I'm just dropping them over. I don't have a camera over my thing, but I just dropped that into our strainer, and then we're immediately going to drop it into our ice bath here. So, and then what I like to do is just give them a little bit of a turn until we no longer feel any heat coming off of the noodles. Also, it tends to fog up the camera when I do that. Yeah. You also do that for rice if you want to dry it in the fridge. Ooh, good idea. Yeah. So the tricky part about drying rice in the fridge is that you can spoil things in your refrigerator if you do that, because what happens is that once you put cooked rice into the refrigerator, the steam from the cooked rice will start heating up other things in the refrigerator, which has happened to me, and I've actually spoiled some eggs doing that. So yeah, that's actually a really good idea. So you drop it in some rice. So Paul, do you put I'm wondering, do you put the rice into an ice bath? Is that what you're doing? In the rice, and then I guess that would halt the cooking, and then drop it into water. It kind of sounds like the right idea. Never thought of that. Cool. So those are our noodles. We're gonna set those aside. In a couple of the noodle dishes that we've done, I think we did it in the tomato. I think we did it in all of the chow mein recipes. We did it in the tomato beef chow mein, and then we did it hot and spicy chow mein. Both of which, what we did do super often. Anytime that I think, pretty much anytime that you cook chow mein. So that's like the really iconic thing that you see with chow mein is that the noodles are par cooked, so they're seared. And in order to get them to sear like that, you would normally toss it in a marinade. So usually in those recipes, I toss it in about a tablespoon of dark soy sauce and a tablespoon of sesame oil, and then you can cook it. In today's recipe, we're not actually going to do that because that Zha Jiang Mian has so much salt in it already. I don't think it actually needs a marinade on the noodles. But if you're in the world of chow mein, that's generally something that you would see at this point is a quick marinade on those noodles. Oh yeah, so you put, for the rice, you strain it and then you put it in a strainer in an ice bath. Under cold tap might also work too, yeah. I wonder if that's what I was just reminded of the Uncle Roger video, where she runs the rice under cold water, cooked rice under water. I wonder if that's what she was doing. I don't know why I just thought of that. Anyway, over on the stove, I'm getting my wok heated up. I probably should have been heating this up already, but we're gonna get this thing ripping hot and we're gonna be ready to cook. So, for those who have been watching this whole time, you will notice that our stir fry is going to start coming together really quickly here. So we've been prep cooking and par cooking for almost a half an hour. Yeah, about a half an hour, a little bit more than a half an hour now. And at this point, everything else that's going to happen in this wok fry, it's going to happen in maybe about 10, less than that, probably about 5 minutes, maybe even less than that. And the reason for that is because we're going to be cooking on extremely high heat, which means that high heat is going to flash cook stuff really, really quickly. Mainly that's going to be our ground pork. We're using pork or turkey, I forget. So the things that we're cooking, they're going to be cooked very, very quickly. So as we cook, we want to make sure, this is also very important, not just in wok cooking, but in general cooking in general, is that we want to make sure that everything that we just did, it's got to be done already. So at this point, once you get onto that wok burner, you want to be done chopping. So you don't want to be chopping garlic or ginger. You don't want to be mincing stuff. You want to be, all of that stuff has to be done already. So that when we get onto the wok and that wok heat is on, because we're going to be on a timer at that point, we want to already be done prepping so that our full attention is devoted to the wok. Yeah, Uncle Roger wasn't happy with the lady, but you're on her side. Yeah, I'm going to have to go back and look again. But that kind of sounds like, maybe that's what she was doing. So you cook the rice, run it under water, it cools down the rice, then you can put it in the refrigerator, and then you can make fried rice with it. That actually makes quite a bit of sense. And that's probably what she was doing, now that I think of it. That's amazing. I'm so glad I learned that today. I'm gonna try that. I cook a lot of fried rice. So. Right, so into our wok, we have all of this nice smoke coming off of our wok today. That's what we're looking for, all of this smoke. That means that our wok is nice and hot. I ran out of peanut oil, so today we're cooking with, this is a little bit of grapeseed oil. I mentioned this pretty much anytime that, but if you don't have peanut oil, that's not the end of the world. You can also just use anything that is sufficient for high heat cooking. So you can use canola oil, vegetable oil, anything that will have a high smoke point. So the main things that we're avoiding here today are things like, we want to avoid things like olive oil, and I actually like to avoid sunflower oil too. That's a personal preference though. This is a little bit more oil than I'd like, so I'm pouring a little bit out here. Alright, so going in first is our ground meat. And what we're doing, so I'm doing my very best before this gets into the wok to start breaking up these large clumps. This tends to be useful, especially when we're cooking in a wok, because things are cooking so fast that once they get into the wok, they can start cooking and setting before you have a chance to get in and start tossing. If you don't do a great job of breaking those lumps apart, it's not the end of the world, but you do want to get in there with your spatula as soon as possible and start separating these clumps. So mainly what will happen if you don't remember to do that is you'll essentially end up with like a big old hamburger patty, which is not what we want. So I'm just running through here, breaking up these large clumps. So we're gonna let that go. Usually that takes me about a minute, maybe a minute and a half. At this point, you're gonna notice that the cornstarch that we included in our marinade is gonna start coming into play here. What that's basically doing is it's slowing down the exterior cook of our ground meat so that the interior portions of that ground meat can finish cooking. That tends to be really useful on really, really high heat stuff like what we're doing today because it kind of makes sure that we don't overcook that ground meat. If we didn't, then you tend to end up with like ground meat that's a little bit chewy, or either that or you end up with ground meat that hasn't been finished cooked on the inside. So that cornstarch, it basically just sort of helps us balance out the cook time. Cool. So what I'm gonna do next here, so we're gonna push all of this aside. It's a little bit more water than I'd like. That might be because we're using ground turkey. But you'll notice in my wok, all this water is starting to pull up. This isn't actually fat. This is all just liquid that's coming off of our ground meats. I have a feeling it's because we're using ground turkey and it has been pumped full of water, which I don't love. It's also the reason why I generally prefer to be using ground pork, but here we are. So what I'm doing here, so I'm just pushing things to one side and I'm gonna let a little bit of this moisture burn off because I don't love how that's looking. Actually, the other thing that we can do, jar for your fat. So over on the side, I have this jar, and it's what I use anytime that there's more fat in my wok than I'd like there to be. Today I'm just using it for our extra moisture, which I don't love that's happening. So I'm just pouring off some of that extra water. You could probably put that down the sink, but if you're not sure if it's water or fat, we probably don't want that to go down the sink, especially if it's fat, though. You don't want that going down your sink because what will happen is that fat is going to coagulate into the bottom of your sink, and then you're going to end up with a clogged sink, which is not great. So now that we got that extra liquid out of our wok, I'm adding a little bit more oil. That's maybe another 2 tablespoons of oil going back in. And then finally, here's our aromatics going in. Here's our garlic, ginger, and the whites of our green onions. And then I'm just going to bloom this in our oil here. So you'll notice I have all of this pork pushed to one side. And that's just going to give us the opportunity for our aromatics to cook on the wok heat and cook in that hot oil. And that's going to let all of the fragrant qualities of these aromatics sort of start popping out a little bit more. And once you start smelling that fragrance, we can go ahead and mix that up. What platforms are most people watching on? Yeah, I think most people watch on Reddit. Actually, I think it's split between Reddit and YouTube. Yeah, I think most people find it on Reddit and then usually pop over to YouTube. YouTube has the bigger, like, wider view, so you can open it into full screen. I don't think that you can full screen on Reddit. So that's my shiitake mushrooms going into the wok. Those mushrooms, they don't actually need to cook very much. They don't need to cook at all, actually. So usually I just like to toss to combine and then add our noodles here. And then give one more toss. And then unlike our, what we did, did pad see ew, yes, on Tuesday. So unlike that pad see ew, our Our chow fun noodles, they're actually pretty durable, so we can still do some more aggressive tossing without risking breaking them apart. And then lastly, the last thing that we're going to add here is a little bit of stock. Today we're using chicken stock. You can use veggie stock if you don't want to use chicken stock. You could use beef stock. I think I've used pork stock at one point. Any of those will work fine. If you don't have any of those things, you can also just use plain old water. That will work too. I want there to be a little bit more sauce here, so I'm going to add a little bit more water. And then finally, I'm pushing things to one side as best I can one more time, and then we're going to add our cornstarch slurry. This is going to start thickening stuff up in our sauce base. So at this point, if you're more familiar with Italian cooking and Italian pastas, this is basically pasta water to the pot. That's essentially going to thicken our sauce up a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, people flick through on Reddit. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. All right, so right now I'm just letting sauce tighten up a little bit. I'm gonna let it go for. We're kind of looking at. I'm mostly looking at the general texture of our sauce here, which is a little bit looser than I'd like. So I'm gonna let that tighten up for maybe a minute, and then we should be ready to eat. Hakka noodles or ramen? Yeah, ramen. So pretty common. So if you come across a Zha Jiang Mian in a Japanese restaurant, you'll pretty commonly see it done with ramen. There we go. So I just let a little bit of that moisture burn off, and it's sort of tightening our sauce up, and then we're kind of getting that sauce cohesion that we're looking for, and now our sauce is a little bit tighter. And that's what we're looking for. So I'm killing the heat, and we're going to remove this. Once again, and my right-handers here. We shouldn't leave that on the stovetop. Finally, the last thing that we want to do anytime that we cook in a carbon steel wok like this one is we want to give the wok a good rinse, especially once you're done cooking. You'll find that while the wok is hot, it has this nice non-stick surface that's going on. This tends to be pretty useful for our cleaning purposes because it means that we can basically rinse everything off. So you'll notice all of that residual sauce that didn't come out of the wok, it pretty much just came right off. I didn't scrub anything, I just used a little bit of pressurized water, and that comes right off. And then next I'm just giving it a quick wipe, and that's going to be it. Sometimes, not every time, but maybe every 5 or 6 cooks, I like to give it a little bit of oil, cooking oil, and that just sort of prevents the wok from starting to carbonize. It's very useful. Yeah, crunchy carrots. Yes, that's next. There's our carrots coming up. There's our camera. All right, let's finish this up. So do yourself a favor, make sure and clean that wok while it's hot. You'll thank yourself when you come back to it when you're done cooking, because it won't be nearly as difficult, or it will be much more difficult to try and clean once it's cold and stuff is stuck to it. Zha Jiang Mian, by the way, I believe it has origins in Beijing street food, which means that we don't do very much fancy plating. Usually we just drop it in. I don't think I've ever seen fancy plating with Beijing Zha Jiang Mian. So no pasta swirls today. So we're garnishing this. This is our julienne carrots. These carrots, as a reminder, are raw. And finally, our greens of our green onions. If you remember to get it, this would be the point to include those cucumbers. Be a nice addition too. Since we don't have cucumbers today, we're using the greens of our green onions. Probably the main reason that we don't have cucumbers is because they spoiled on me a couple days ago. But definitely a pretty common one would be julienne cucumbers at this point. Yeah, one of my favorite noodles. Like very, very umami forward. Lots of really interesting flavors. That fresh stock is actually playing really nicely. If you've never used fresh chicken stock or fresh veggie stock, and the things that you cook, it adds a real nice little quality to it that you generally don't get from the chicken bouillon stuff. Also, definitely more than what you would get from water. Also, that black bean paste is giving us a nice, black bean paste has this very, very aggressive quality of umami to it. That's very, very forward and very, very present. So I love using it, but when you do use it, you want to make sure that we're using it in moderate quantities. So we use that 4 tablespoons or a quarter cup for a pound of noodles, which is a lot of noodles. So go easy on that stuff when you do use black bean sauce. I say the same thing when we do things like dark soy sauce. Also similar things when we use things like doubanjiang or gochujang, all of those things. Use it in pay attention to the quantity that you're using that stuff in, because if you overdo it, it will absolutely just ruin the whole dish. So, cool. Cool, thanks everyone. As always, with the things that we cook on stream, there's a recipe video that lives over on my YouTube channel. If this is your first time catching one of these streams, my name is Wesley, this is Wu Can Cook. We're here live streaming every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 PST with new recipes that are out on my YouTube channel every Friday. So I want to say like 6 months ago or so, we came out with a recipe for this Zha Jiang Mian, and it's actually one of my favorite pantry noodle dishes to come out or bring out. Not quite a pantry noodle dish because actually almost entirely a pantry and freezer friendly dish. So we every like month or so you'll probably see me cooking this, mostly because it's one of my favorite dishes to cook. So if you have any questions, feel free and drop those questions in the chat. If you haven't watched or checked out the recipe videos yet, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel and check out that stuff. Those recipe videos, they tend to move a little bit slower, so if you're trying to reproduce the things that I'm cooking, those tend to be a little bit more useful to bookmark than these really, really long live streams, because I don't get sidetracked and tangent a lot. I also don't forget to do things like boil the pasta water, so lots of stuff like that living up over on the YouTube channel. We have new recipes throughout every Friday, so last Friday was a Chinese xiangbing, which is like basically a pot sticker that's been flattened, and that's something that you find in a lot of dim sum restaurants. This Friday, as in tomorrow coming up, is going to be a recipe for a Chinese steamed shumai, which is like a steamed dumpling that you find in a lot of dim sum too. Lots of fun stuff coming up like that. Oh, any spicy sauce? Actually, no, not really any spice in this particular Zha Jiang Mian. And actually, most of the Zha Jiang Mians that I've had, you probably won't find a lot of spice. I want to say the Japanese ones that I've had, they get pretty spicy, but to me, at least to my taste, Zha Jiang Mian is generally not a spicy one. It's more of a very aggressively umami dish. But yeah, if you want to, you can absolutely include some spice. In this particular one, if I was going to add some spice, I would use some doubanjiang. That would be a nice addition. Although I would say it might get a little bit overboard. If you do that, you probably want to dial back that black bean paste because it gets really, really aggressive. Yeah. Cool. What else? Yeah, lastly, if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel yet, definitely check out what's going on over there. We're working our way up to 5,000 subs by the end of the month, and I think we're like 50 subscribers short or something. So if you want to help us hit our subscriber goal, please hop over and subscribe. Lots of fun stuff coming up every Friday. And yeah, I think that's it. What are we cooking next? So next up, we're making the shumai. So next up, so we won't be streaming tomorrow, but we'll be back next Tuesday, and we're going to be cooking through the shumai recipe that's coming out tomorrow over on the YouTube channel. So did I put love in it? Yeah, I put love in everything that I cook. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you soon. Oh, for the folks who are local to the San Francisco Bay Area, we have this new fried rice pop-up. It's called Wu Can Cook. We cook all of the fried rices that are coming up on the channel here. So if you want to come by and say hi, if you're Bay Area local, we'll be at the Hayward Farmers Market Saturday, all day Saturday until 1 p.m. So come by and say hi. All right. Bye. Oh, there's more about that. wucancook.com/. Bye.
If you think that you don't know, never mind, that you still don't love yourself, no. You can find it from somebody else, no. Whoa. Everybody's got to grow up sometime. Funny how we shoot the move, still will we fight it, baby. Alright, never mind. Everybody wants to be different. I still got dreams, but they don't love me like they used to love it. And I'm reminded of how bad I used to want it. And yes, I still got dreams, but more like a toolkit of my 20s, and it's breaking me down. Want to be, baby, yes, whiskey. You're real sweet as strawberry wine. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stoned on your lip all the time. I live for love, all the same old places. Found the bottom of the bottle was always down. But you poured out your heart, and I didn't want to waste it. There's nothing like love to give me you're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. Ooh, yeah. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time. You're as smooth as Tennessee whiskey. You're as sweet as strawberry wine. You're as warm as a glass of brandy. Darling, I'll stay stoned on your love all the time.